Good morning. Welcome to our session on how policymakers can fulfill promises of security for cloud services. I'm Charlotte Newman. I lead financial services public policy for Amazon Web Services in the Americas. I'm really delighted that we have two excellent speakers today, Mark Wetjen from the Deposit Trust Clearing Corporation and John Brady from FINRA. And for me, as a public policy professional, this conversation is particularly very interesting and relevant. And I know that Mark and John have a tremendous amount of knowledge around how organizations and regulated industries face hurdles from policy, regulatory to cultural and organizational hurdles and address them with the security of cloud services. I'll pose questions to our panelists today for about 40 minutes and then turn it over to you guys for Q&A. But to kick it off, let me provide a quick intro of both of our speakers. John Brady is Vice President in Technology for Cyber and Information Security for FINRA and is the organization's Chief Information Security Officer. In this capacity, he is responsible for all aspects of FINRA's information and cybersecurity programs. He also ensures compliance with related laws and regulations. He oversees staff focused in 4 primary information security areas: security architecture and controls, security management tools, application security, and identity management. Mark Wetjen is Managing Director and Head of Global Public Policy for the Deposit Trust Clearing Corporation, with responsibility for developing and coordinating strategic engagement to help shape policymaking that impacts DTCC's interests around the world. Prior to his current role, Mark served as a commissioner on the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the U.S. market regulator that oversees activities and trading in derivatives markets. He was nominated by former President Barack Obama in March 2011, was confirmed by the U.S. Senate in that year, and served through August 2015. During part of his tenure, Mark served as the CFTC's acting chairman, managing daily operations and setting the overall policy direction of the agency. Thanks. Before we dive right into questions, actually, I'd love to first begin by having both Mark and John talk a little bit about what each of their organizations do and what they are, because some of you may be from different regulated verticals, and I'm familiar with FINRA and DTCC. So John, why don't you get us started?
So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Amazon, for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. So FINRA, for those who don't know, we are a private, nonprofit regulator of the stock market industry. We're about 80 years old. We were established by an act of Congress in the 1930s, and we have this dual mission. It's to protect investors and to ensure that the markets themselves remain fair and equitable to everybody that participates in them. So we provide a lot of services to our industry to achieve that, ranging from resolving disputes between individual investors and their stockbrokers to regulating the markets by inspecting all of the activity that occurs in terms of trading and order routing. That market regulation activity is what has prompted FINRA to move into the cloud. And we did so over 5 years ago. And it was partially out of necessity to solve operational issues we had with our traditional data warehouse approach at the time, but also because we saw a tremendous opportunity to change and transform the way we did our processing of this high volume of data. And as you can see from this slide, the current volumes are pretty extreme. The typical day ranges between 30 and 50 billions of events, and those are from orders to routing of orders to trading venues to trading activity, and then the allocations that go back to the stockholders' accounts. It adds up to a lot of data, and on really busy days, it's about 135 billion. We keep 7 years history of this data. Right now, it's over 30 petabytes and grows by about 7 to 10 petabytes per year going forward. You don't usually think of regulator and innovator in the same sentence, if ever. Those two words just don't go together. But FINRA is a little different. We have always adopted technology as quickly as we could wherever it solved problems for us. And one example is we started NASDAQ in 1971, which most people don't realize. We changed names in 2007. We used to be known as NASD, the National Association of Securities Dealer, and the AQ at the end of NASDAQ stands for Automated Quotes. And so we started this system in 1971, and like I said, we've been an early adopter of technology throughout the years where it makes sense.
Great. Mark, why don't you go ahead with a description of DTCC?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, for having me this morning, and thanks to AWS for hosting the conference. It's great to be here with all of you. DTCC actually has some similarities to FINRA. We're a little bit different in the sense that we're a for-profit institution as opposed to a nonprofit. But we're also a self-regulatory organization, a little bit different again legally than FINRA, but similar in the sense that we have that function with our members. We are the central place for settling U.S. securities transactions in the United States. In fact, we're the only organization that does that for publicly traded securities. And another way that I think is important for us to describe ourselves is we are also systemically important financial market utility companies. In fact, we have 3 entities designated as SEP205 for short. And I mention that specific designation because I think it tells a lot about the sort of regulatory expectations that firms such as DTCC have. I think there are, I shouldn't even guess, 5 or 6 SEP205s in the United States, thereabouts. But again, we're unique in the sense that unlike the other SEP205s, we're the only ones that do what we do in the United States. And just to also add a few numbers that tell a little bit of the story of the organization, on a typical day, we process around $4 trillion of securities, and annually that's usually roughly around $15 quadrillion worth of securities activities. So beyond the securities processing, the other thing we do is we have a variety of other post-trade businesses and services, and those include services in the derivative space. Those are primarily reporting and data services. And then we also have some other trade matching type services in the securities realm that are not confined to just the United States, but are services that we offer overseas as well.
Great. So now that the audience has a sense of both of your organizations, why don't we turn to the first question? So John, I want to first start talking about FINRA's cloud journey. And I know that FINRA has publicly stated that cybersecurity is better in the cloud than in privately managed data centers. And at the time of your migration, that would have been a bold statement. Can you talk a little bit about how you got there?
Yeah, so in late 2013 is when we began looking at the cloud as a way to improve our market regulation processing. And it was a crazy time to be thinking of taking any critical workloads to the cloud. There were a lot of organizations, obviously, that were born in the cloud at that time, but there were very few existing enterprises that had made the decision to move workloads into the cloud. And you know, for us, our initial goal was just to achieve parity. We wanted whatever we did in the cloud to be at least as secure as our current practices at the time in our private data centers. So we were looking, you know, for the same sorts of controls that you could implement. And we looked at a number of different cloud providers at the time. There were several. None were anywhere near as mature and developed and feature-rich as Amazon. So it really left us with a choice of one, and then it was a question of, is that one good enough? So I had my team spend about 6 months evaluating all of the security services that were available through Amazon and built into the features and services we were going to consume, as well as third parties that we could add to that cloud solution to enhance it. And it was easy to get to my goal of parity. And you know, and then we began doing proof of concepts and moving workloads. And at the same time, Amazon was innovating and introducing new features. And really the key turning point for me was the key management service. That changed everything in terms of how we could protect data in the cloud. And when you introduce that, that's when we realized we could easily achieve a much higher outcome in the cloud. And as you can see here, there's a lot of features that helped convince us that this was the case. Microsegmentation is a huge thing. If you are not doing it in your organization, learn to do it. And the concept here is each individual server can be put in a security zone of one, which is very difficult in your traditional data center where you have wide LANs and a few firewalls. In the cloud, every virtual server instance is wrapped by security groups, which are a firewall essentially, and you can make those very tight. So that prevents horizontal traversal. You know, if that one server gets compromised, it's hard for the attackers to expand their reach into other servers because there's no access there. It's rare that a web server needs to talk to its neighbor. They often have to talk to a middleware server or backend database, but they don't have to talk to other servers at the same tier. The federated identities with super fine-grained entitlement is huge. The visibility that you get in the cloud was something that in a private data center, you know, you'd had to scan your networks to find new boxes that appeared and were deployed. And then once found, you'd have to scan them again to tell if they were compliant. In the cloud, that's an event because everything's done through APIs. You can immediately trigger checks through config and inspector and other tools, our own personal tools that we developed, to make sure those things are compliant. As I mentioned, KMS, being able to encrypt everything at rest as well as in motion. And now serverless like Lambda or containers, EKS and so on. It's just reducing the attack surface area even further because there's, at least for us, there's nothing that we need to maintain. We're trusting Amazon is maintaining the underlying OSs and keeping them patched, but it reduces the work we need to do. And we've also automated everything, which results in a very high level of consistency of build. So we establish hardening guides for our DevOps team. They create images and deployment processes that comply with those hardening guides. And then those patterns are just reused by each project team to roll out their infrastructure. And those AMIs are refreshed every month. And you know, as we make changes to our provisioning scripts, those are immediately adopted by each project team. So the level of security compliance across the organization is now at 100%, where back on-prem, where we handcrafted everything we built, we were lucky if we managed to get over 90%. And the other thing, I guess the big point I want to make is when you move to the cloud, it's a partnership. Obviously, it goes both ways. We're consuming services and getting benefits out of consuming cloud services, but at the same time, we're very dependent on that cloud provider for those services. They need to be secure, they need to scale with us, they need to have the features and capabilities that we require. What I've seen from Amazon is that's all there, and especially on the security front, if I look at what Amazon spends on security, it is in excess of FINRA's entire technology budget. So there's no way I could compete doing things in my own data center and get anywhere near the level of quality and completeness of security design in the services that Amazon delivers to us.
Great. So it sounds like partnership is certainly a key thing here. Yeah. And as you talked about your migration journey, you also touched a little bit on organizational changes. And I want to dive in on that and really focus on what you shifted exactly organizationally to migrate your crown jewels to the cloud. What cultural shift was necessary to make that happen?
Yeah, so the market reg systems that I mentioned earlier, those are our crown jewels. I mean, they represent about 90% of the data footprint at FINRA and about 75 to 80% of our compute capacity. Historically, that was true in our private data centers, and it's still true today in the cloud. So it was a big deal for us. And you know, we started out doing proofs of concept, both from a security perspective as well as from a service delivery and operational perspective to make sure we could build our systems, taking advantage of the cloud architecture and cloud feature sets, and achieve the outcomes that we were after, the high performance, the scalability, taking advantage of elasticity, all those things. But before we went forward, we wanted to make sure we had buy-in at the top levels of our organization. So we put together a business case and took it to our board of directors. And along the way, we also convinced our internal audit team that this was the right thing to do, and our outside auditors, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, they regulate FINRA. We also met with them and explained what we were doing, why we were doing it, how we were doing it, and why they shouldn't be concerned, how we got the security model the way it should be. So it was a big deal. I would say the board of directors, I wouldn't call them enthusiastic, but they at least said, go ahead. They saw risk there, but they were willing to take that risk along with us. And they gave us the funding to go ahead. And then it all went pretty easily. So we built a core team that was focused on cloud while we continued all of the other traditional operations in the data center. And that core team really has totally transformed FINRA technology over the years. We changed everything when we moved to the cloud. So we were a traditional waterfall development house, used a lot of commercial off-the-shelf software to build those systems. Now we're open source, we're agile development methods, we're fully automated in terms of DevSecOps with a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. We've integrated all of our security testing tools into that automation pipeline, so every time there's a new build that's heading for release, it kicks off static code analysis and as well as automated regression testing of QA. So it's just been a complete change in the way the organization operated. And it was interesting to see at the time, people kind of fell into three camps within technology. There were the true believers who wanted to be on that core team, and there were those who thought cloud was just insane. And I wouldn't say they actively resisted, but they certainly didn't help. And then there was some in the middle that were kind of, checking the direction of the wind with a wet finger in the air. And if they saw success on the cloud side, they were going to become believers. And if they saw anything go wrong, they were going to jump to that third group. Thankfully, things played out well. And, FINRA also, in this same time frame, I should mention, we, as a regulator, we receive data from the industry we regulate. So we don't think of it as our data. We think of it as the industry's data. And we're just the custodians of it for regulatory purposes, and some of it is quite sensitive. We did not want to move that data to the cloud without going to our industry and explaining to them as well what we were doing. So our CIO, Steve Randich, and myself, we put together this roadshow, and we visited all of the large brokerage houses as well as all the stock exchanges and explained to them what we were doing. And they all got it. They I think in a sense, we kind of have changed the direction of our industry, again, by being an innovative regulator. There are very few regulators that have moved to the cloud before their industry has, and FINRA has done that.
Great. And just before we came on stage, I know you were talking a little bit about how you've been on a 5-year journey around cloud. And looking back on that journey, what would you say have been your key learnings, and what are some of the major benefits that you've realized from migrating 90% of the data?
So I mentioned that we transform market regulation by that elasticity, the limitless capacity, the low cost of storage in the cloud. All of those things have allowed us to change the way we prepare the data for use by our internal investigators. Our old systems, were traditional data warehouses. You would make decisions on which columns you chose to index because it was expensive to index. It took a lot of processing power and a lot of storage space to build those indices. In the cloud, with low-cost storage and a lot of CPU, we basically index all fields that an investigator may ever want to do an operation on. And now, queries that used to take hours or even in some cases days or never complete, get done in less than a few minutes. And most of what they do as an investigator is truly interactive. I mean, they're operating across billions of rows of market activity and trying to find those needles in the haystack that represent, insider trading or attempts to manipulate market prices. And, now they can just iterate through that in near real time without having to go get a cup of coffee after they submit a query, which was kind of the way they used to work. They were lucky to get, half a dozen queries in a business day. Now they can do a half a dozen queries in 5 minutes. And in terms of learning, I guess it kind of goes back to the first question you asked, Charlotte, which was, being more secure in the cloud. Again, it was a surprise when we first started that we quickly got to that point where it was obvious to us that all of these capabilities that you get in the cloud, almost for free. I mean, KMS is an amazing example. For $1 per master key per month, and you don't need a lot of master keys. I think we have maybe 200. So for $200 a month, we're getting a key management service that protects our keys in hardware appliances and allows us to protect all our data. In a traditional data center, acquiring that, building it, operating it yourself would cost millions of dollars per year. So it's just one example of the kind of power that you get out of a strong cloud provider. And my CIO always says, if he had to do things over, he would have done things much faster. We would have moved more, quicker, sooner.
Wow, that's great, thank you. Turning to you, Mark, you in your introductory remarks talked some about how the Deposit Trust Coin Corporation is a market utility and kind of the special responsibility that represents. Can you talk about how that's influenced your cloud migration roadmap?
Yeah, sure. I think there's two pieces to this that you alluded to. One is the regulatory designation, and then the other is the ownership and governance structure of the organization. And again, like John's organization, it's really important when you have a governance structure like ours where your owners, in our case, are actually your largest clients. The alignment is going to be there naturally, but you also have to make sure that your key stakeholders, in this case your owners and customers, are on board with the project that you want to try and initiate and see through. And so a lot of those conversations, again, a lot of things John was saying in his in describing FINRA's journey rang true for us too. There was some effort to try to get our board on board with what we're trying to do. And again, in our case, the owners of the organization and those that govern us are the largest financial institutions in the world. So you have all the usual suspects: Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, Citi, and so on. Those are, again, the owners and the key clients. And a lot of their organizations were in different places in their own cloud journeys. And I'm not sure of the details of each individual firm, but I think there was some novelty to this idea that a firm with our regulatory designations would be pushing forward in this way at the time that we did. And I have to give a lot of credit to FINRA because they were a huge part of the organization embarking on this, and DTCC learned quite a bit from FINRA and some of the personnel there because, as you could hear, they went before we did, started their journey before we did. I think what's a little bit different is, again, going back to the regulatory designations, the onus was even higher on us. And so we had to work through that. We had to understand the implications ourselves, but again, also describe that and make sure our board understood that as well. But in the end, a lot of support for what we're trying to achieve several years ago. And again, without knowing all the details, I think a lot of those same firms that own and govern us have embarked in earnest on their own journeys.
Great. And I know it was great to hear John describe the ongoing engagement that's been necessary and important for FINRA's journey with the SEC. I don't know if you would want to add anything additional to that. You've described a little bit kind of in your kind of opening take there, but is there any sort of take on the process for DTCC that would be, I guess, informative for our audience?
Yeah, so we approached it in a couple different ways. The first was we had a bit of a public campaign, and it wasn't a terribly aggressive one, but what we decided to do was we needed to try to demystify the implications of leveraging cloud vendors if you're in the financial services space, and especially, again, a firm such as ours with the designations that we have. So we put together a paper a couple of years ago, and we weren't necessarily trying to break new ground, and it was an interesting process when we started it. Part of the paper was about how we saw the technology and how we plan to use it, but the other piece of it, and this is where my department came into play, was describing to the reader all the different things that had already been done by way of guidelines coming out of the official sector. And that was actually even true of the SEC, but it was fascinating to see that all around the world there was considerable amount of work that had already been done by way of guidelines and guidance coming from some of our supervisors. And I think the issue was there's just a lack of awareness of that. And in fact, that lack of awareness was also true within our own organization. So that ended up being, I think, an important piece of the paper, just to, again, explaining that there's a lot of work that's already been done here. This isn't as wild and scary as it might seem. The official sector is doing this themselves. And again, just sharing those facts really with as many people as we could was an important part of our strategy. And then the second piece was obviously just the one-on-one bilateral engagement with each individual supervisor. And again, we have supervisors embedded within the organization. So we have staff from the Fed and the SEC that sits right with us, and so we're in constant dialogue with our supervisors, and it would only be natural that you would have discussion about whether you're going to make changes to your technology infrastructure. But then the other thing we did, in addition to those more routine conversations where that topic was brought up, we elevated the discussion within the various agencies, and so we had important visits with Fed board governors, with SEC commissioners, and all the rest. So that was all part of the campaign, and I think was pretty effective. So yeah.
Great. And looking back on your journey, what would you point to in terms of the biggest benefits and learnings from that process?
Yeah, I think in some ways. We were having our conversations with the SEC. The organization was having conversations with AWS and for other things, other cloud providers, but I think by and large, the focus for us has been with AWS. But I think a lot of the dialogue really was just between the DTCC and AWS. So, and the reason I say it that way is because the organization has been around for 40 years. We have a lot of personnel that's been with the organization for quite an amount of time. And so there's a very deep understanding, and it's really embedded in the culture of the organization, this idea that we serve a public mission and our regulatory responsibilities are really important. When our CEO and the board meets, that's the topic of conversation always. It's how do we ensure market stability? That's the key part of the mission. And how do we keep that dialogue and that engagement with our regulators intact? And so because of that history, because of that mindset and that mission, we have a very, very good understanding, I think, of what's expected of us and what's specifically in the legal sense required of us. So, Charlotte, I know you and I have talked about this over the years. A lot of it has just been our representation to AWS of what we believe our expectations are. And sometimes that's not always precisely the same as what the actual expectations might be. So that's been part of, I think, one of the interesting parts of the journey that we've had with AWS. But I think the engagement early and publicly is really important. And as far as specific benefits, and again, this is probably more on the cost side and technical capability side, but certainly we're moving to a place where we're going to have a lot more flexibility and a much higher ability to control our costs. And I want to just mention a specific example here. We have our trade information warehouse business, which is one of those derivatives industry businesses I mentioned before, and we're pursuing a replatforming of that particular business. Part of it was moving from the mainframe into AWS, but also it involves a distributed ledger application. And so we've been working on this project now for a couple of years, but to test the proof of concept as to whether or not it made sense to deploy that software, DLT software, it would have been very, very costly, very cumbersome, very difficult to do if we had tried to do that in an on-prem environment. And instead, we tested that proof of concept in the cloud, and that allowed us to make a decision much more rapidly. And then just as it relates to business as usual considerations, again, there's almost endless amounts of money you can spend if you want, because as John alluded to before, there's so many different features that you can take advantage of. But from our point of view, it also gives you a lot of ability to control your costs. And we're still pretty early days, to be fair, and we haven't actually succeeded in moving all of our tier 1 processing, as we call it. So that's the processing related to some of those very, very critical components of security, settlement, and clearance. But we're moving towards that and working our way towards that. But we haven't realized, haven't gotten there yet, and so we haven't realized all the benefits, but we can see that there are many, and just the one I would identify, and again, I think John alluded to it before, is resilience. That's I think what we're finding more than anything else, something that's really, really important about moving to the cloud. And so again, if you are an institution such as ourselves, with the expectations that people have of us, to be able to demonstrate and to actually make your organization more resilient through leveraging cloud vendors is really important. And it's becoming more important as the days go by, as it relates to the policymaking conversations that are underway globally.
That's right, and I'm glad you brought that up. We're definitely hearing a lot more about the benefits of resiliency in the cloud. So,
and if I can just make a distinction too, it's probably clear enough to the audience, and John, I'm guessing you would agree with this. We've talked earlier, and John mentioned earlier, some of the key tools and resources and personnel that AWS has to prevent bad things from happening, to put it in layman's terms.
Sure.
But where the conversation is moving to in the policymaking sphere is not just in trying to keep bad things from happening, but how do you ensure that you can continue operating? So it's really that continuity of services piece that's becoming more and more important. In fact, there was a release last fall that came out of the British policymaking community, and that's, I think, probably the first release that spoke about the issue in this way, but it's only being adopted around the world, and not so much publicly and formally here in the United States, but I can tell you, based on our own private conversations with the regulators and some of the things they've asked us to do as of late, it's definitely how they're thinking about it.
Got it. Well, John, because Mark ended on a kind of a forward-leaning perspective there, I'm actually going to, jump to the second question here, and I'm curious to hear your perspective here, because I often hear from customers about just the rise and the increase in the number and complexity in some cases of cyber incidents. From a forward-leaning and forward-looking perspective, what are you doing at FINRA, and what do you think other regulated organizations can do going forward to be more proactive? You talked some about automation before. Is that the key, or is it a mix of things? Yeah,
it's definitely a key for FINRA. Unlike most organizations, I've never built a physical SOC, right? Don't have a room with big screens and people sitting there watching them, because there's not a lot of value in that. There's a lot of expense, but not a lot of value delivered. Instead, we've invested our energy, our time, our resources into automating security. So I mentioned CloudTrail and CloudWatch logs earlier. We ingest everything that's going on in all of our systems, all of our network devices, everything in the cloud, into a centralized SIEM, and we then have a number of automated processes that run against that event store that are basically doing automated threat hunting to find anomalies, or if there is a very clear pattern that should never occur, then we build heuristic alerts around that pattern, and those go directly to my tier 3, tier 4 security engineers. I don't really have a tier 1 or tier 2 other than to do like identity and access management and more of the basic security operation in terms of administering security across the environment. In terms of handling events and anomalies, it all goes to my most senior people. So that's our approach. Not every organization can achieve that, and as a regulator, we're trying to set the best example we can for our industry, while realizing that the largest organizations that we regulate have deeper pockets and more resources that we do. We try to achieve parity with those, while recognizing that the smallest firms in our industry, which can be very small, can just be 2 people, servicing a couple dozen customers, they don't have those kinds of resources. So we try to be flexible in terms of our regulatory policies that we push out, our rules, and the expectations that we assert on the industry through our examination process to be accommodating to that very wide spectrum of firm that we regulate.
Great. And I am going to get your thoughts on the first one too,
Okay.
just because, because I'm really curious, especially in from your perspective as a CISO, how you really built cybersecurity protections into your presence as you architected yourself in the cloud, and then why was that so important to accomplish that?
Yeah, so we began our journey in late 2013 and into early 2014, and at that time, most of the security tools that you have today didn't exist. KMS didn't exist, for example. But certainly GuardDuty, Macie, WAF, Shield, you name it, the whole litany of security services that Amazon offers now, they did not exist. I needed those, so we built them. And FINRA has, actually we've open sourced quite a few of the things we've built over the years. I think it's a total of 17 AWS or cloud-friendly tools that we have open source. They're all on GitHub, or you can go to technology.finra.org and you'll find links there into the GitHubs for those. Most of them are more DevOps related or data management. So I mentioned, market regulation, that huge volume of data. One of the challenges we had there is data formats change over time, right? Or data gets submitted by a market participant and a few days later, they realize the data had errors in it, so they have to resubmit it to us. So we have this versioning problem. So we created this thing called HERD, H-E-R-D, which is a data management layer, and all of the data that we take in basically gets checked into this system, and it keeps track of the versioning, and then any operation, whether it's our automated surveillance patterns or investigative work, picks up the latest versions of the data. But we have to keep it all because we may have made regulatory decisions on an older version of some data, and we need to explain those or figure out what's different between those and the latest version of the data. So we keep it all. So that's one example of something we built as we moved to the cloud. But we also built some security tools. There's a thing called Fidelis, which is a secrets manager. You now have a secrets manager. Mm-hmm. We needed one a few years ago, so we built it. Portis, which is a security group workflow system, gives our developers the freedom to create security groups in their development environments and then promote those to production. And in the process of promotion, my security team reviews those security groups and makes sure they're safe to use in production. So it's improved flexibility and empowers developers to create, but at the same time gives my team the control to ensure that we're fully secure in production and do it all in a very efficient electronic workflow. So a couple examples of things we did. And then the DevOps process, the whole CI/CD, like I said earlier, we've integrated all the security tools into that so that automated scans are kicked off. And we haven't quite got there yet, but we will be there by the end of the year. If there's any critical findings, we will automatically block production deployments. Today, there's actually a human in the loop who reviews the compliance reports before they push the button for production deployment, but we want to get that fully automated as well.
Sure. So Mark, I definitely want to get your perspective as a former regulator here. I know you well understand how regulatory agencies think about cybersecurity and digital transformation. What advice would you give to our audience attendees who might be from regulated organizations and are planning their own cloud strategy and thinking through how to deeply engage with their CSP and regulatory agencies?
Yeah, I would say two things come to mind. The first is resiliency, as we mentioned before, but let me come back to that. And then the second thing is, is this idea that it has to be very, very clear for those firms that are regulated financial services firms, if you're going to use a third-party vendor of any sort, and in this case, this is especially true when you're considering a cloud vendor, who is your technology infrastructure provider, it has to be made very, very clear that control remains with the regulated entity. And there's a lot of ways you can demonstrate that. There's actually regulatory obligations that help with that. There's guidance that helps with that. But that has to be part of the discussion, and so it has to be made plain that whichever firm that's about to use AWS or any other vendor has to make it clear to their supervisor that they understand that the responsibilities and the obligations at the end of the day rest with them. And so AWS or someone else might be a partner, and there's a lot of important things that they can do for you, but ultimately it's on you, the regulated entity. So there can be no confusion about that, and to the degree that there is, it might give some pause, I would say, to your supervisor. And then turning back to resilience, that's the thing I believe is at the moment not well understood by the policymaking community. I think in some pockets you see a pretty good understanding of this idea that if you have a vendor partner that has virtually an infinitely larger number of data centers at their disposal and can make those available to you as a regulated firm, that's way better than the situation many financial services firms find themselves in today. In our case, we have 3 data centers that we rely upon here in the United States. And again, the math is very, very straightforward.
Sure.
If you have the right architected service plan with AWS, you can just have a lot more infrastructure at your disposal. So that's a pretty straightforward story, but again, I'm not sure it's one that a lot of policymakers have spent a lot of time focusing on or thinking about. And as I said before, meanwhile, the mode of thinking among the policymaking community has evolved and has shifted, I would say, in the last year or two. And everyone has now accepted the fact that, look, there are going to be cyber incidents. The threats are only increasing. There's no indication that that's going to abate anytime soon, if ever. You have nation states that are getting involved with this sort of game. So there has to be an acceptance that this sort of thing could be, an attack could be something you have to deal with. And so again, the question then is, if that happens, how do you make sure you can continue providing very, very important services in the case of DTCC? And the same applies to any other firm, though. You might have a slightly lower regulatory burden than DTCC has, but nonetheless, that's the sort of thing that supervisors and policymakers are going to want some assurance about.
Got it. And in terms of educating policymakers and regulators, you probably have seen that we've put out some white papers on resiliency. Yep. And we're certainly partnering not only with DTCC, but other customers in doing that education. Going a little bit offside for a second, I'm always curious to hear a bit about the backgrounds of speakers when I attend sessions like these. And Mark, you're in a particularly interesting role as the global head of public policy at DTCC. So I'm curious to get a sense from you on what you're thinking about, what keeps you up at night, and I don't know if you're paying attention much to 2020 and what your thoughts might be there, or how that might impact the discussion we're having now.
2020? Do you mean the election?
Yes. Mark and I both have backgrounds from Capitol Hill prior to our current roles, so I figured I'd.
Well, the debates start tonight, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So that should be a Democratic debate, so that should be interesting. No, I hate to sound like a broken record, but for our organization, this topic of resiliency is so important. It's critically important, and the work just continues, and the expectations, again, continue to increase and intensify. And I just, again, don't see that changing. And so I don't necessarily worry about us being able to deliver on what we're required to deliver on from a regulatory or supervisory point of view. But by the same token, with the threats increasing, you just worry about how that will feel and how the organization is going to react if we have to deal with a real life cyber incident of significant scale. So again, I don't think that's a concern that's unique to DTCC in the financial services space, but pressed with the question, what's the one thing that worries me some? It would be that. And then the other thing too is, I don't know how best to put it, but there's so many other parties involved in the provisioning of these services. And if you even focus specifically on AWS, AWS could be doing everything right, DTCC could be doing everything right, but there are other parties involved that make it possible for AWS to provide its services. And we found this outside of the cloud vendor context. This has happened recently to us where there's another, let's call it utility type system that was involved in settlement, and something happened there where it was out for some amount of time. And again, totally out of our control, didn't see it coming, but it always leads to a lot of internal discussions and a lot of questions about how can we do things differently and how can we do better. And so I just think this constant recognition that there are going to be unknown issues and unknown threats apart from the ones that you expect or in addition to the ones you expect are there, it can be a little bit unnerving at times. Again, when you're in the role that a company like DTCC is in.
Right, and as you know, policymakers and regulators are constantly having to think about, here are the set of things that we expect could possibly happen, but you don't know what you don't know or what you can't predict the future, and that's certainly kind of a tension
just
here. Yeah.
Tying it to a more specific regulatory or policy issue, it relates to the points I was just making, but if you look at the SEC's regulations, there are certain cyber safeguard responsibilities that different firms have depending on their registration or depending on their license. And one of the things I've begun to think about a little bit is you have, because of quirks in the development of the policy and how the law reads and the rest of it, you have a lot of activity happening on certain trading platforms that don't have the same cyber-related safeguard responsibilities as other platforms that are hosting very, very similar types of activity. And you wonder what that could invite, let's say. And so that's just one example, but there are gaps like that as you begin to look around the world at the sort of, again, policies that are in place with respect to cyber safeguards. And that's never going to be the full solution. And like I said, in any case, it's probably never going to prevent any and all cyber incidents or attacks. But it would be better, I think, if those gaps are identified and closed.
Great. And thinking about predicting the future and things changing, we talked a little bit about this ahead of time, but John, I'd love to get your perspective on how you see the role of a CISO changing. Have you seen it changed? Like, where do you see it headed? Because I'm sure there have been some impacts as we talk about automation and other factors shifting over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's changing dramatically. When I started as CISO at FINRA, I guess it was 7 years ago, the role was heavy tech focused. It was figure out the technical approach to keeping the bad guys out of our systems, which as an engineer, I love that challenge. I look at it as a problem that needs a solution, and knock on some wood, the solution we have in place is doing quite well. The transformation has really been to more of a business leadership function, at least at FINRA, and I think it's happening at all organizations, where security was an afterthought. It is now very much a forethought in everything that FINRA does. That whether it's developing a new system, where we have shifted the security requirements all the way to the left side, and have a very strong partnership with our dev organization, to the point where they're becoming security professionals. And we're seeing that happen in other business areas across FINRA as well. And I think it's a transformation every organization is going through, that in order to survive, you do have to be cyber resilient today. And it's less about preventing breaches, as Mark pointed out. It is about surviving breaches. So a breach that disrupts your business in a serious way can put you out of business, especially if you're a smaller organization that doesn't have the resources to draw on, whether those are financial resources or otherwise, to survive that breach. Before we moved to the cloud, there was a service called Codespaces. I don't know if you remember it. I don't know if anybody here remembers Codespaces. I'm not seeing any hands. But anyway, Codespaces was a source code repository. So it was a safe place to put your source code so that if something went wrong in your operation, they would have a copy of it for you. And so the idea behind it was they would build resiliency for your software development house. They operated out of Amazon, which we all would think would be a good thing, but they didn't have good IAM practices. They just used like root keys to log in and do all their work. They had apparently had a former employee, wasn't so happy, still had root keys. They didn't rotate them after that person left, and guess what they did? Logged in, deleted everything. So then Codespaces called up Amazon and said, hey, can you please restore our data? And what do you think the answer was? I mean, if you could restore data after we deleted it, then you'd be breaking one of your basic tenets of security that you provide for us. So you were not able to restore them, and they went out of business. For me, that was a great lesson. As we began to move into the cloud, we were not going to take any chance of repeating that same mistake. So we have a very sound IAM policy where we create roles, for each individual in the organization. We federate identities with our internal identity stores. We don't create access keys. We don't create user accounts in Amazon. We don't want yet another place where we have to manage the life cycle of an account. We already do that in one place, and we just leverage it. And then furthermore, we don't give those roles the ability to delete data. They can create stuff, they can modify it, but they can't delete an S3 bucket, for example, or a database instance. Instead, we created this special role we call master destroy, and that's usually empty. And as soon as somebody gets added to it, I get an alert, which tells me, ooh, something's going on here. I better find out whether they got a change ticket that authorizes this work. But that's how we've managed that risk. And again, to kind of deviating away from where we started this question, but it's really an inherent business function these days, the managing security and ensuring all of those risks, those potential risks of the organization, including those absolute disasters that could put the organization out of business. I have to ensure those are well managed, that they're thought of, and that the various ways in which they might happen are covered.
Great. Well, I could keep asking you questions for quite some time, but I do want to give an opportunity to audience members who have questions for you too. So if there are audience members who have any questions, raise your hand right here. We don't have mics, so I'll try to repeat the question if
I'll try to speak loud. Work for the Options Clearing Corporation. We're also assisting kind of a smaller version of DTCC. We've begun our journey to the cloud for our core clearing risk platforms. In 6-8 months in, it's going to take us 3 years. Maybe this is a question for Mark. How much push are you getting from the regulators, or you being a former regulator, about being multi-cloud? Right now we're in AWS. We haven't gotten a lot of direction from the SEC or the CFTC as to the importance of being multi-cloud. We have multiple layers of redundancy via AWS, but is there any view from the regulators that you're aware of about being just dependent on AWS? Do we need to be multi-cloud? At DTCC, or even at FINRA, have you received any encouragement to be multi-cloud?
Yeah, it's a great question, and apart from how much the issue is raised by our supervisors, it's nonetheless something that we think about a little bit. And it's hard for me to answer your question because I'm just one person at DTCC who has some of these conversations, and as you can imagine, I'm sure it's true of OCC. There are a host of people that are having conversations all the time at various different levels within the SEC and the Fed. But my impression is that it's not something that strikes me as a burning concern of the Fed and the SEC, at least at the moment. I've not heard it mentioned personally. I've not heard anyone from those agencies say that, look, we really have an expectation that you have redundancy in your cloud vendors, but I would be shocked if it hasn't been mentioned by someone within those organizations. So it's a little hard to judge, but I would say it doesn't seem to be the most pressing of concerns. I guess a related issue would be concentration risk of cloud vendors, which maybe is the first cousin of having redundancy in the relatively small enterprise-grade vendors that are out there right now. That is something that we've heard more about, frankly, than redundancy of vendors. But as I said, I can't give you a full answer, but that's just my impression based on my own conversations and conversations I've had with my colleagues at DTCC.
So the FINRA board has raised concern about vendor concentration risk, as Mark termed it, which is essentially, are all your eggs in the AWS basket, and how would you, deal with that if there was an issue with Amazon? And so our answer to date has been, through use of open source and other things, other decisions we make in terms of how to architect our systems, is we have an exit plan. We hope to never exercise it, but if we had to move to another cloud provider, it's not something we could do overnight, but it is something we could do in a finite time period at finite costs and relatively quickly in the grand scheme of things. So, Charlotte asked a question earlier, which I didn't get a chance to answer, which was what keeps you up at night? Hopefully, I try to only worry about the things I can influence. But one of the things that definitely keeps me up at night is Amazon. We are heavily dependent on this great partner we have, and hopefully they will continue to execute extremely well. But if they don't, we will need a plan B at that point. So that's, as I said, an exit plan is our current strategy. Both our board and the SEC seems comfortable with that at this time. I suspect at some point, as the cloud marketplace really matures and there is parity among the top tier cloud providers, then there will be a growing expectation to be multi-cloud for critical infrastructure services, which FINRA only has a couple systems that fall into that category.
Or putting aside cost considerations, if not multi-cloud, maybe there's a failover to an on-prem type data center construct that firms are using. So that's also another option that our organization has considered. I don't make this next comment in defense of AWS or any of the cloud vendors, but the thing I find interesting about the concerns around concentration risk, and they're very valid ones from a policy point of view, but that's a dynamic that's present with a lot of vendors today, right? So as John just said, you can manage that in different ways, but the fact is concentration risk among vendors that's been something that firms like DTCC and I'm sure FINRA has been dealing with and OCC has been dealing with for years.
Yeah, it was IBM for decades, then it was Cisco for all things networking. So it's not a new risk in the technology world. There have always been dominant vendors for a period of time, and then the rest of the industry kind of catches up and things even out at that point.
Yeah, and a piece of what I really heard in both of your responses to that question was exit planning and governance, but really more sort of a plan that regulators will expect that their regulated entities have thought through a whole series of possible outcomes and having a plan around that and governance in place to ensure that they're able to execute. Any additional questions from an audience standpoint?
I also come from financial regulators, so I have one question with kind of two parts. One is, I don't know if you can talk about your strategy for bringing in AWS expertise to your internal teams, and maybe how you're trying to build that, and to what extent you rely on AWS or other third-party contractors. Second part of the question is, and it's kind of out of your realm of expertise probably, but for your bank examiners, are you aware of any sort of strategy to build AWS expertise in that examination side, where they're probably using AWS implementation of the entities that we're
So I'll try to answer your questions first, and Mark, feel free to jump in. So I'm going to start with the second one. I don't know anything about banking regulators, so I can't really answer it directly, but I would encourage you to take advantage of resources that others have built. Cloud conformance, Google that, you'll find a website that has details on how to properly configure cloud services to make them secure. There's, the Cloud Security Alliance, they have guidance. There's Amazon, if it's Amazon context, Amazon has their own security best practices. And I think you want to teach the regulators or auditors about those so that, they learn the right way to do things, and then that is the standards they should be checking for. To your former question, at the time FINRA moved to the cloud, there really weren't any viable third-party consulting services that were experts in moving things to the cloud. We talked to some that claimed they were, and very quickly realized there was one person who could spell it and sell it as well, but no real expertise behind the scenes. So we actually relied on Amazon to bootstrap our own teams. So Amazon has some really good security architects who will come in and help you figure out how best to architect your systems to take advantage of auto scaling and all the other great features in the cloud. We did that for about 3 to 4 months early on, and they helped our teams, in terms of raising their knowledge to the point where Amazon was then coming to us and saying, you don't need us anymore. So I think like any technology that you're adopting, cloud, you got multiple strategies to adopt it. Find expertise that you can bring in when you need them, or build expertise in-house. We decided, doing well in the cloud is such strategically important for FINRA. We wanted that knowledge, that experience and expertise all in-house, and that has been our approach, is to build that.
Did you add resources to support AWS? Just kind of shift things around?
We shifted around, and really now, in terms of the people that used to do infrastructure engineering and operations, that team has shrunk dramatically and has been replaced by automation, quite honestly. So it's a much smaller team with a different set of skills today, mostly coding skills. We don't have many sysadmins sitting around anymore.
Great. We're at time. I don't know if, Mark, you wanted to weigh in at all on that last question, or have...
I don't have much to add other than my guess is your experience has been similar. It's just generally, I think, difficult to find expertise and software engineers that really are familiar with cloud vendors and how to make the best use of them. So there's a little bit of an issue there just in terms of recruiting generally across our enterprise, recruiting people with that kind of expertise and background, because there's a lot of demand for it right now. So apart from whether they're involved in assisting the firm as it relates to its regulatory obligations, I would say just on the development side, it's a big challenge.
Yeah, and of course, we're constantly partnering with customers and also with the broader public sector community to do education and provide training, but it's an ongoing engagement, something that we'll all work together on. And with that, ending on partnership and engagement is certainly where I'd like to stop, because that's been a key theme throughout our discussion today. And I know that our conversations will continue off the stage, and I look forward to that. And I'm really thankful for your travel to Boston and being here today. Your comments, I know, have been very insightful for me, and I'm sure for the audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.